Before the green there was no blue. Before the rustle of leaves or the shimmer of dew, there was a world where stillness ruled. Not silent in the way forests are silent, or empty like a desert after wind, but a different kind of quiet, a deeper one. A kind of breathless waiting. A sky thick with gases that could not yet cradle life. A sun that rose and fell over continents of bare rock, with no one to see it, and no breath to hold it. What if the world was once breathless? Not just without lungs, but without the very idea of air. A planet spinning in space, wrapped in carbon dioxide, methane, ammonia. A hostile mix, blanketing the surface like an invisible weight. Oceans were young, restless, acidic. Winds tore across raw crusts of land, carving canyons without ever carrying pollen. Rain fell, but there were no roots to drink it. Nothing yet to take sunlight and turn it into sweetness. And yet, somewhere in that ancient stillness, something tiny stirred. Something that didn't need oxygen because oxygen didn't exist. Not yet. Something microscopic, tucked away in shallow pools or drifting in sunlit tidewaters. Cyanobacteria, the ancestors of all green things. Not because they wanted to change the planet, but because that's what they did simply by living. They took in light and exhaled something strange. Something dangerous. Something new. Oxygen. At first, Earth didn't know what to do with it. Oxygen was a poison. It rusted iron. Killed early life. Changed everything. It wasn't welcomed. It was fought, buried, swallowed by oceans, absorbed by rocks. For millions of years, oxygen vanished as quickly as it was made. And yet, the cyanobacteria kept going. Kept blooming. Kept breathing in their own slow way. Not because they meant to transform the air, but because life always leaves a trace. And maybe that's what breath is, a trace. A soft signature. A kind of planetary memory. Because slowly, breath by breath, the air began to change. Oceans turned from green to blue. Iron settled in banded layers across the seafloor, leaving behind red rock records that we still uncover today. Atmosphere thickened with oxygen, and the sky began to open its color. Blue appeared not because of pigment, but because of scattering. Tiny molecules bouncing light in new directions. A sky born from invisible breath. But there were still no leaves, no ferns or flowers, just microbial life, layered in mats and films, living on the edge of possibility. The idea of a tree was still buried in deep time. The idea of a forest, unimaginable. And yet, every molecule of oxygen exhaled was a whisper of what was coming. The breathless earth was becoming a breathing one. And not just breathing, but remembering. For breath is more than gas, it is rhythm. Inhale, exhale. Light, dark. Growth, decay. And as oxygen levels slowly climbed, life began to stretch into new forms. Simple cells learned to cooperate. Some swallowed others. Mitochondria were born, tiny engines of energy, only possible in the presence of oxygen. These were the first hints of complex life. Not plants, not yet. But the stage was being set. And then, one day, perhaps on a quiet morning, perhaps over millions of years, the first plant unfurled. A soft green filament. A thread of algae drifting through water. The first leaf, though not yet a leaf. The first chloroplast catching light in a way that mattered. No one watched. No one noticed. But the world changed anyway. Because plants are not passive. They are architects. Sculptors of atmosphere. Engineers of ecosystems. They do not move, but they alter everything around them. And in that first moment of green, the breathless world took its first real breath. It wouldn't have been much. A few more molecules of oxygen here. A cooling of the atmosphere there. But it added up. Over millions of years, the rise of plants wasn't a flare. It was a tide. Slow, unrelenting, soft. The kind of change that only becomes visible when you step far enough back to see an entire planet shifting shape. And yet, how fragile it was. Oxygen may be common now, but it wasn't always. One shift in volcanism, one swing in Earth's orbit, and the delicate balance could collapse. Ice ages came and went. Mass extinctions thinned the green. Entire branches of life blinked out like stars behind clouds. And still the plants remained, adapting, rooting, breathing, painting the planet with pigments we didn't yet have names for, turning light into chemistry, chemistry into air, and air into memory. But what if we lost that memory? What if, buried beneath layers of sediment and time, we've forgotten the earliest forests, the very first rootings of breath? Is it possible that entire epochs of green once existed, now erased by ocean subduction, by fire, by entropy? Could we walk across a plain today, never knowing it once held a forest that changed the sky? And if that much can be forgotten, what else might we have missed? If we listen closely enough, maybe even the air remembers. Not the air we know now, crisp, breathable, laced with oxygen, but the air before leaves, before forests, before green. An atmosphere not shaped by photosynthesis, but by fire, by stone, by the molten breath of the newborn earth. The air of a time when nothing yet grew, and yet everything was already changing. A world wrapped in gases from deep within the planet's throat. Carbon dioxide, methane, ammonia, hydrogen sulfide, thick and alien, pressing against a sky without blue. There was no ozone to block the sun's glare, no rustle of branches to break the silence. Just raw light falling onto naked land, onto oceans bubbling with chemical chants. It is strange to imagine air without life, but stranger still to think that air, too, evolves. Not just because of living things, but because the planet remembers in cycles. Volcanic outgassing poured ancient breath into the atmosphere long before the first root curled into soil. Every eruption, every meteorite strike, every slow leak from a tectonic rift added a note to the early sky's composition. Thick with greenhouse gases, Earth's surface sweltered under a blanket not meant for lungs. And yet, beneath that weight, the seeds of change were being stirred. Even then, even in that breathless heat, oceans formed. Clouds gathered. Rain fell. Over time, carbon was drawn from the sky into rock, locked away in limestone tombs and silicate minerals, forming the first slow carbon cycle. Not because Earth was ready for life, but because entropy never sleeps. Weathering began, even without roots. Water shaped stone. Winds polished craters. Dust rose, drifted, settled. And in settling, laid the groundwork for something new. Still, the air remained unkind. Toxic to us if we had been there. But we weren't. Nothing with a spine or a leaf or a breath had arrived yet. Only microbial life drifted in shallow seas, living off chemical gradients, fueled not by sunlight, but by sulfur and metal and heat. No one was watching the atmosphere change, but it was changing anyway. In this deep time, this forgotten air, even light was different. Without oxygen, the sky would not have scattered blue. Perhaps it looked hazy, tinted orange or red, as photons moved unhindered through dense molecular haze. A world under a veil, a planet squinting toward the sun. And yet, beneath this strange sky, chemistry never stopped dancing. Isotopes of sulfur tell us of fleeting oxygen pulses, tiny breaths that vanished again. Could these have been the earliest warnings? Were there near misses before the real greening began? We don't know. Maybe the planet tried and failed to hold oxygen before. Maybe early life bloomed, only to be erased by volcanic winters or the quiet pull of ocean subduction. Perhaps whole chapters of Earth's story were written in gases, then lost. Subducted slabs of ancient seafloor now hidden deep in the mantle may still carry whispers of that early air. But we can't reach them. Not yet. All we have are mineral clues, isotopic trails, the faintest residue of something enormous. And so, we breathe now without thinking, inhale, exhale, never wondering what it took to make air a thing that could be used. But the air before leaves was not passive. It was active, dangerous, alive in its own slow way. It burned, it corroded, it smothered. And yet, through all this, it waited. For pigment. For photosystems. For chloroplasts and stomata. It waited for leaves. But what is a leaf, really, if not a kind of interface? A membrane between light and chemistry. A translator between star and cell. Before there were leaves, there was nothing to hold that conversation. The air spoke in elemental tongues, and no one was yet listening. And still, if we lean close enough, we might feel the shape of that silence. We might sense the heaviness of a sky not yet lifted by photosynthesis. And we might wonder, how did life ever dare to breathe into such air? What courage did it take? Or was it not courage at all, but accident, repetition, entropy? Could it be that the air before leaves wasn't waiting, but simply unfolding? And if atmosphere can shift so slowly that the planet itself forgets the way it once felt to exist, then what else lies buried in that forgetting? Perhaps the memory of the microbes who came first, the ones who never needed roots, only rock. And in that rock, perhaps they left something behind, a mark, a shadow, a hint. Something will begin to uncover as we look into the ancient stone and meet the rock-eaters. Not myth, not metaphor, but the true architects of the earliest change. Long before trees, before ferns, before even the idea of a stem, there were microbes, quiet, persistent, unseen. They lived not in forests but in films, in shallow seas, in tidal flats, in sunlit layers of slime pressed against warm stone. They were not green yet. They had no leaves, no veins, no flowers. But they knew how to feed, not with mouths, but with light and with rock. These were the gas makers, the first to breathe not as we breathe, but to change the air itself simply by being alive. Some clung to underwater rocks, forming domes of mineral-coated life called stromatolites. Their shape was slow, building upwards grain by grain, year by year, as if time itself needed somewhere to rest. Others burrowed into crusts, etching tiny caverns in stone, leaving trails not written in ink, but in isotope ratios and carbonate fossils. They left behind no language, no tools, no skeletons. But they left layers. Layers that rose from the sea floor like silent monuments to breath. These microbial mats, so fragile and small, transformed Earth in ways no storm ever could. Not because they were mighty, but because they were many, because they were everywhere, because they endured. They split water with sunlight, releasing oxygen into oceans too young to notice. At first, that oxygen vanished into iron, rusting the seas into blood-red beds that hardened into stone. Banded iron formations, ancient stripes of red and gray still sleeping beneath deserts and mountains. And when the iron was used up, the oxygen began to rise into the sky. This was no sudden bloom, no dramatic upheaval. It was slower than driftwood turning soft in the sea, slower than continents moving, slower than memory fading from bone. But over millions of years, this microbial breath began to shape an atmosphere. Not because it was meant to, but because chemistry doesn't need intention. It just needs time. And there was plenty of that. Still, the gas makers were not the only ones at work. Deep in Earth's crust, other microbes feasted on hydrogen, sulfur, iron. They lived in darkness, in boiling vents, in the cracks beneath the sea. Some still do. They do not need oxygen. They never did. They speak the language of stone and metal and heat. We call them extremophiles. But to them it is not extreme, it is home. And they too have written their presence into the rocks. In isotopes, in mineral scars, in the chemistry of ancient mud. So we have the rock-eaters, living by dissolving the minerals that once cooled from fire. And the gas makers exhaling oxygen not for breath but as a byproduct of light harvesting. Together, they built the scaffolding for what would come later. For green, for stems, for forests and flowering. But their legacy is deeper than roots. It is molecular, atmospheric, planetary. And yet, how often do we forget them? How often do we walk across limestone cliffs or trace the curve of a canyon wall, never knowing we are walking on breath made solid? On the exhalations of the invisible? Could it be that every breath we take holds echoes of theirs? Not symbolically, but chemically. Oxygen passed from cell to cell, from leaf to lung, from tide pool to starlight. A lineage not of blood, but of gas, of invisible memory. And what of the stromatolites? Some still live in places where the world feels ancient: Western Australia, the Bahamas, a few hypersaline lagoons. They do not look like much. just stony mounds beneath ripples of water. But they are time made visible. Living sculptures of Earth's first whispers. And when we see them, really see them, we are not just looking at survival, we are looking at origin. Maybe they are not ancestors of plants in the strict sense. But they are ancestors of the idea. Of photosynthesis. Of turning light into energy. Of reshaping the planet from the inside out. The path from microbe to moss to maple is not straight. But it is continuous. A chain of slow miracles built across billions of years. Not because nature planned it, but because entropy allows for strange order when given enough time. Because even the simplest life leaves ripples. And those ripples over deep time become waves. So when the first true plants began to grow with veins, with roots, with cells that held chloroplasts like tiny suns, they were not inventing something new. They were continuing a song. One that had started long before. One that still hums in the rocks, in the oceans, in the thin oxygen we barely notice as it passes through us. And if breath can begin in silence, and if stone can remember light, then what might it have felt like? That first moment when a green thing cast a shadow on stone. Maybe it didn't feel like anything. Maybe it felt like everything. And perhaps, as we follow that shadow forward, we'll begin to notice the silence before forests. There was a time, not so long ago in the language of rocks, but impossibly distant in the rhythm of breath, when the world was quiet in a way we no longer remember. Not empty, not dead, but untouched by the particular noise of leaves. A time before roots cracked open the crust, before trunks stretched upward, and branches mapped themselves against the sky, before green learned to climb. And in that hush, the earth listened to other sounds, slower sounds. Wind brushing over bare hills. Rain meeting stone without interruption. Oceans washing ancient shores without the sigh of grass or the hush of moss. Imagine a valley without trees. Not deforested, but preforested. No stumps. No memory of wood. Only plains of rock and dust and shallow microbial film clinging to the edges of water. The sky, too, would feel different. Not filtered through canopies or refracted by mist rising from leaves. Just direct light, unsoftened, clean, and beneath it, the world breathed without rhythm. No photosynthetic heartbeat, no seasonal shedding, no green tide rising and falling with the sun. This was a silence not born of absence, but of becoming. The long pause between breath and speech, between the possibility of forests and the reality of their roots. The silence before forests was not the silence of nothingness, but the silence of potential. A silence filled with memory yet to be written, patterns not yet begun. The kind of silence that hums if you stay still long enough. And what did that silence teach the earth? Perhaps it taught patience. The long erosion of mountains into minerals. The slow layering of sediments pressed into history. Perhaps it taught timing, the way tectonic plates shift just so, opening rifts, lifting ranges, folding coastlines. Or maybe it simply allowed space. Space for light to reach untouched surfaces. Space for microbial mats to thicken. Space for chemistry to wander, experimenting across eons. There were no forests yet, but there was change. Subtle, molecular change. Oxygen drifting higher. Carbon dissolving into rock. Rain cycling through the sky. Volcanoes painting the air with ash. Continents moving like drifting thoughts across the mantle. And always entropy at work. Breaking things down. Rearranging. Making room. Not because it wanted to, but because that is what time does when left alone. And through it all, the silence remained. Not complete silence, of course. There were sounds. Earthquakes. Thunder. The cry of wind down basalt cliffs. The boil of geysers. But no rustling. No crunch of bark beneath foot. No insect wing brushing a fern. No bird. No leaf. The silence before forests is hard to imagine. Because it is not just an absence of noise. It is an absence of certain kinds of noise. The kind we have grown used to. The kind that reminds us we are not alone. And yet, in that quiet, something was forming. In the soils that did not yet exist, in the shallow roots of ancient liverworts and mosses clinging to rock, in the first vascular threads that dared to grow taller than a whisper. Forests were still a dream, but the earth was dreaming. And isn't it strange to think that silence could prepare the planet for sound? That stillness might set the stage for growth? That before the forests came, the world had to learn how to hold them? Maybe it's not so different from memory. How sometimes, before we remember, there's a pause, a space, a breath. And in that breath we wait, for something to return, for something to emerge, for something to take root. Because the silence before forests was not the end of something. It was the beginning. And if the world needed that silence to make way for forests, what did it need to allow the first shadow to fall from a leaf? What did it take for the first leaf's shadow to be cast? What did it take, indeed, for something so small, so tender, to break the stillness of a world that had never known shade? Not the shadow of a boulder or a mountain or a passing cloud, but the shadow of something living, something soft, something green. That first leaf, whatever shape it took, was more than just an organ for catching sunlight. It was an event, a quiet revolution, the moment pigment and light shook hands across the breathless span of deep time. Maybe it was flat, simple, almost transparent. Maybe it was no more than a slightly widened stem. But it caught the sun differently, held it, filtered it, played with it. Chlorophyll, that ancient green alchemist, had found a home in structure. And through it light stopped being just warmth, and became energy, became memory, became something Earth could use to rewrite itself. And for the first time sunlight touched the ground, only after passing through life. And that changed everything. Because a shadow is not just the absence of light. It's a footprint. It's a signature of shape, of presence. And that first leaf's shadow may have lasted only a moment, cast on stone or still water or ancient mud. But the echo of it rippled outward. Plants had begun to master the geometry of light. They were learning how to stretch, how to grow toward the sun, how to trade shade in space and height. The world was no longer just shaped by gravity and erosion. It was being shaped by hunger for light. And the leaf, so deceptively simple, became the canvas for that hunger. Within it, chloroplasts danced in microscopic patterns, shifting subtly with the sun. The leaf pulsed with the flow of water, minerals, sugars. A thin, living surface stretched between sky and soil. A translator, a bridge, a kind of silent language written in green. And yet, we do not know what the first leaf truly looked like. The fossil record is a soft and partial thing, subject to entropy, to time's forgetting. Most leaves decay before they are ever noticed. Before they are preserved in silt or ash or sediment. They fall, they curl, they dissolve into soil. They return to the dark. Even now, most leaves live briefly, a single season, a handful of weeks, then disappear. They leave behind almost nothing, except their effect. But sometimes, if conditions are just right, a leaf's impression is captured in stone. We find them pressed like ghost prints in shale, delicate veins etched where soft tissue once touched mud. And when we see them, these stone leaves, it feels like looking at the shadow of a shadow. Not because they're gone, but because they were once so briefly here. And yet, their briefness didn't stop them. The leaf is one of nature's most persistent ideas. It is endlessly reinvented. Broad or narrow, toothed or smooth, stiff or curling. Leaves adapt. They test. They whisper their shapes into time. And each one, each tiny surface reaching for light, casts its own small shadow onto the land below. Imagine that moment. When the first true leaf reached upward, and beneath it, a spot of ground fell into coolness. A break in the brightness. A flicker of contrast. A whisper of shelter. Perhaps a tiny insect paused beneath it. Perhaps a drop of water clung to its edge. Perhaps nothing at all noticed. But the world had been marked. And once marked, it cannot be the same. Because with shadow comes space. And with space comes layering, competition, ecosystem, temperature gradients, microclimates. The forest is born not all at once, but in this, the difference between light and less light, between sun and shadow, between what is exposed and what is touched only gently. Could it be that the earth, in that moment, took a deeper breath? That it felt, for the first time, the sensation of coolness under living shade? Maybe, maybe not. But what we know is this. The first leaf's shadow didn't stop at the ground. It spread into the atmosphere, into climate, into the rhythms of erosion and water and wind. It changed how light moved across the surface of the planet, and how the surface responded in return. And if a single leaf could do that, just by catching light and casting shadow, what happened when millions of leaves followed? When entire landscapes began to shift under the soft weight of photosynthetic skin. If the first shadow marked the beginning of change, then the roots that followed would shape the very bones of the earth. And somewhere, in the silence below, the rock began to soften. The crust began to open. The planet began to feel the first pull of roots. And the pull was slow, gentle at first, almost imperceptible. Not a tearing, not a breaking, but a kind of invitation. The roots did not force themselves into stone. They asked it to open. Thin filaments, delicate and deliberate, threading into cracks, following lines of weakness etched by time and water. Seeking, always seeking, not because they were trying to conquer the crust, but because they were hungry, hungry for minerals, for memory, for the invisible nutrition locked away in ancient bedrock. Roots changed everything, not loudly, not quickly, but absolutely. They reached down while the leaves reached up. They created a tension between gravity and light, between silence and respiration. For the first time, life wasn't just skimming the surface. It was burrowing into the deep, not into oceans, but into the land itself, into the literal bones of the earth. Stone is not lifeless. It holds history. It holds chemistry. But for most of time it was inaccessible to living things, until roots arrived. And with them came an entirely new way to break the world open. Not with heat, not with pressure, but with patience. Root hairs exuded acids that dissolved rock, atom by atom. They turned granite into soil, basalt into clay. They weathered the unweatherable, not because they meant to erode, but because erosion is a side effect of survival. And survival is slow, especially when stretched across millions of years. Roots turned landscapes into stories, into layers, into dust. Mountains that once pushed into the sky began to slouch. Crags softened. Valleys widened. All beneath the quiet insistence of plant life feeding from stone. The roots weren't just plumbing for water, they were sculpting futures. And as they reached deeper, they released more than minerals. They altered the chemistry of entire regions. Silicates broke down into bicarbonates, which flowed with rivers to the sea. There, they bound with carbon dioxide, forming marine shells that would someday settle into limestone. The carbon drawdown had begun. The air was being rewritten from below. We walk on this inheritance without knowing it. Every path, every trail, every stretch of farmland and forest floor owes itself, in some way, to those early roots. And yet, how often do we think of them? They are hidden, quiet, slow. They do not blossom. They do not reach toward us. But they are always there, holding the ground in place, holding time in place. And in the dust they created, in that powdered memory of ancient stone, new things could grow. Soil, true soil, not just sediment or ash, but a medium rich in decay and life, in bacteria and broken leaf, in weathered rock and memory, a substance that remembered both death and growth. Roots made this. Not alone but fundamentally. They wove the deep and the surface into one continuous system, a living interface between what was buried and what reached for the sun. But stone does not forget easily. Some rocks still bear the chemical fingerprints of their weathering. Isotope trails, acidic etchings, microscopic pits where rootlets once touched quartz. Fossils not of organisms, but of interaction, of effect. And beneath the oldest forests, if we dig deep enough, we can sometimes find paleosols, fossil soils, that tell us how ancient roots shaped the land. Their structure, their reach, their intention. Could it be that roots are a kind of memory? Not just for plants, but for the planet? That, in their branching patterns and their mineral affinities, They are holding onto something deeper, something we don't yet know how to read? Maybe, maybe not. But even now, deep roots stretch into bedrock aquifers, into fault lines, into the chemical seams of forgotten mountains. They don't just seek water, they seek knowledge. Not as we do, but as roots do, slowly, sensitively, with unspoken direction. And as they deepen, they unlock stories we didn't know were buried. Stories of past climates, recorded in mineral dust. Of vanished ecosystems, sealed in clay. Of volcanic ash turned fertile by time. They pull the past upward bit by bit into living tissue, into trunks, into leaves, into the breath of animals who never knew the stone they owe their breath to. And so we wonder, if roots can crack stone, can they also crack time? If a leaf is the face of a plant, is the root its memory? Is the dust in your hand, that fine powder clinging to your skin, the afterimage of a root's long patience? Perhaps, perhaps not. But we know this, wherever roots go, landscapes follow. Wherever they linger, the ground changes. Not just in form, but in possibility. And if the roots have drawn time from stone, what happens when the air itself begins to respond? What happens when plants learn not only to shape the land, but to shape the sky? They begin to breathe through stone, not over it, not beside it, but through it, quietly, persistently, the way roots whisper into cracks, the way water carves paths in silence. Because plants did not only rise toward the light, they reached downward with just as much longing. And as they did, the stone began to change. Mountains, once jagged and defiant, began to soften, slowly, not because the wind grew stronger or the rain more frequent, but because life had entered the equation. Life that could move minerals without force. Life that could dissolve feldspar into clay. Life that could take solid rock and, over time, turn it into breath. It's strange to think of breath being mined from stone. But that's what happened. As roots burrowed deeper, they released acids, faint, organic, patient. These acids met silicates and carbonates, iron oxides and ancient grains of quartz. The reactions were subtle, molecular, invisible, but they mattered. They changed the composition of the rock, atom by atom, molecule by molecule. And the byproducts didn't just stay in the ground. Some were carried by water to rivers, then to oceans. Some entered the air. Some became part of living tissue. Carbon was pulled down. Oxygen rose. And in this quiet dance between chemistry and biology, the atmosphere shifted. Mountains turned to memory, not metaphorically but physically. The ridges that once held back the sky were worn down grain by grain. Plateaus gave way to fertile plains. Valleys opened where once there were cliffs. And in their place new things grew. Forests, wetlands, fields of moss and fern. The stone was not lost. It was transformed, rewritten, not erased, but translated into life. And in the layers left behind, the dust, the clay, the silt, we find echoes. Geologists read the trails like forgotten sentences. Isotope signatures that tell of ancient weathering. Ratios of strontium and neodymium that reveal the long journey from rock to river to reef. A leaf may crumble in weeks, but the stone it changed carries the fingerprint for millions of years. Could it be, then, that plants wrote themselves into the land not just by growing, but by dissolving? That erosion became a kind of authorship? Maybe, maybe not. But the record is there, waiting in shale and sandstone, in the chemistry of old soils and the bones of long-buried trees. And if we look closely, we begin to see that breath is not separate from earth. That what we inhale today may be the result of ancient ferns dissolving volcanic ash, or moss softening granite. The air and the land are not opposites. They are conversations. And plants were the first fluent speakers. They didn't need language. They needed time. They needed patience. And the earth gave them both. And so the world began to wear a new kind of skin. A skin made not just of stone or moss, but of process. The slow abrasion of entropy met with the gentle insistence of life. Where once only glaciers and wind shaped the land, now photosynthesis and respiration joined in. not with violence, but with rhythm, not to break, but to breathe. And this breathing didn't stop at the surface. Beneath our feet, even now, roots and fungi and bacteria continue the work. Weathering, dissolving, exchanging, feeding the sky. Plants, long after their first emergence, still breathe through stone, still turn mountains into air, still rearrange the planet's crust as if it were memory. And memory, like stone, can be heavy, but it can also be soft, can be worn down, shared, scattered, inhaled, exhaled. And if mountains can be changed by breath, if oxygen can rise from mineral, then what other invisible acts might be rewriting the world right now, just beyond what we notice? If the crust can be softened by roots, can the sky itself be reshaped by leaves? Maybe it already was. Not all at once. Not in a single season or even a single epoch. But over time, the kind of time that stretches so wide it starts to blur at the edges, the sky softened. The light bent differently. The air began to hold its breath in a new way. And all around the quiet, rocky face of the planet, something subtle began to spread. Not fire, not frost, but green. It didn't arrive with fanfare. There was no sudden blossoming, no planet-wide curtain rise. The greening of Earth was not an event. It was an unfolding, a slow, almost shy expansion, like moss edging across stone, like light creeping over the horizon, a planetary gesture of softness, of persistence, of breath made visible. At first, it was filaments, algae, mat-like textures in shallow water. Then came liverworts, clinging to damp ground, with no true roots, no stems, just the memory of green pressed low to the earth. And then the ferns, the club mosses, the horsetails, small at first, almost modest, but rising, reaching, gaining structure, vascular threads, branching forms, tissues that could support height. And all the while the land changed. What had once been bare, sharp, hot, silent became veiled. Plants crept over ancient rock like memory returning to a forgotten thought. They filled the cracks carved by weather. They softened the edges of old lava. They took the bones of the earth and clothed them in pigment. But green is not just a color. It is chemistry. It is signal. It is the outcome of chlorophyll absorbing all the light it does not need and reflecting what it cannot use. Green is the color of refusal, of selection, of choice. And when Earth turned green, it wasn't just pigment scattering sunlight. It was photosynthesis reshaping the atmosphere, pulling carbon down, sending oxygen up, adjusting the thermostat of a planet. The sky grew cooler. The oceans breathed easier. Clouds changed. Weather changed. Climate learned to listen to plants. Because plants do not just grow in response to the world. They make the world respond. And the more green spread, the more the world changed to suit it. And yet, no one watched. There were no eyes then. No wings. No feet. No creature stood atop a hill to witness the world blooming beneath them. The greening of Earth happened in solitude. In wind. In silence. In geologic pulses so slow they slipped past awareness. Even now, when we try to imagine it, our minds struggle. What does it look like to watch an entire continent shift color over millions of years? What does it feel like to walk through a land before green, and then walk again 100 million years later and find it forested? Could we even tell what had changed? Would the air smell different? Would the silence be gone? Would the light fall in a new rhythm, filtered through leaves instead of striking bare stone? Maybe, maybe not. But the memory of that transition still lives in pollen trapped in rock, in spores fossilized in lakebeds, in chemical signatures left in the breath of ancient soils. The fossil record, though incomplete, is textured with green. We see impressions of ferns, carbon stains of stems, shadowy outlines of early leaves. And though they do not speak, they hint. They hint at a world in motion, a world unfolding, a world being rewritten one cell at a time. It's tempting to think of the greening as a kind of success, as evolution's triumph. But maybe it wasn't about domination. Maybe it was about presence. Plants did not take over because they were strong, but because they were steady, because they endured, because they learned how to turn sunlight into survival, and survival into sediment. They changed the rivers, the rainfall, the winds. They pulled nutrients from stone and released them into the cycle. And then they died. And in dying, they returned those nutrients to the soil. A loop, a breath, a system. Could it be that the earth turned green not because of competition, but because of repetition? Because enough plants did what worked again and again, until the landscape became fluent in that language? Until the planet, maybe it remembered how to be green. And if color can be a kind of memory, if pigment can be a kind of presence, then what did it mean when the green began to bury itself? Because not all plants stayed soft. Some hardened, thickened, grew tall, and when they fell, they did not disappear. They fossilized. They layered. They began to store carbon. And in that storage, in that burial, a different breath began to form, the kind that lives deep beneath our feet. The kind that turns to coal, to pressure, to history, the kind that makes us ask, what happens when carbon begins to cradle itself? Maybe it becomes memory, not written in books, not carved in tablets, but held softly in the soil, in layers, in weight. Because after the green had spread, after it had learned to root, to stretch, to fall and rise again, something quiet began to take shape beneath it all. A second life. One without light. One that began the moment each plant died. Not an ending, but a folding. A layering of breath into the earth itself. When leaves fell, they did not vanish. When trunks splintered, they did not drift away. They gathered, sunk into waterlogged swamps, pressed into low valleys, trapped in still places where decay came slowly. The air was different then, wetter, thicker, unfamiliar. And in those damp pockets of the world, the fallen green began to accumulate, a soft compression, a piling on of time, and with each season more stems, more leaves, more fragments of forest life, crushed gently beneath their successors. And then again, and again, until the cradle was full, until the cradle overflowed. Peat, then lignite, then bituminous, then anthracite, the stages of carbon hardened over eons, the vocabulary of forgotten plants, not because they were meant to last, but because the earth had made a bed for them. A bed without wind, without fire, without oxygen, a place where breath could rest, and not escape. And this, maybe, is how the planet learned to hold its breath, to sequester carbon, to draw it down from air and sea and living body, and tuck it deep into sediment. It wasn't a plan. It was a process, slow, looping, patient. Life rose, died, was buried, and with it the sky changed. The air cooled. The balance shifted. Could it be that Earth became more stable because it learned how to bury what it no longer needed? Not because it hated carbon, but because it remembered what carbon could do. Remembered the heat, the storms, the wildness of an unfiltered sun. And so, life began to regulate itself. Green things became guardians of equilibrium. They absorbed, they stored, they disappeared, and in their disappearance, they gifted the world silence. We walk across these beds now. Ancient forests turn to coal seams, swamp layers turn to dark shale. We burn them, we dig them, but long before we arrived, these were tombs of atmosphere. Breath converted into depth. Oxygen's other half, buried like a secret. Sometimes, if the burial was fast enough, we still find the fossils whole. A frond perfectly preserved in black rock. A seed cone trapped in time. A log so well fossilized it clinks when tapped. These aren't just remains. They're pauses, suspended moments when the cycle slowed down and made an imprint. But most of the time, there's no form, just carbon, just compressed, cooked matter. Whisper-thin layers stacked like time's own fingerprints. And still, inside, the chemistry remembers. Isotopes trace the story of where the carbon came from, how warm the climate was, how acidic the rain had grown. It's easy to forget that forests were once responsible for cooling the world, for pulling trillions of tons of carbon from the sky and storing it somewhere safe. Not because they understood the danger, but because they followed the script of decay. of entropy, of falling and returning. And maybe this is the strange beauty of plants, that they are both alive and willing to die, that they give their structure back so freely, that their bodies become landscape, become burial, become breath held in stone. And if enough breath is buried, the world begins to exhale more slowly. The temperature drops, ice appears, seasons sharpen, and the planet dreams longer dreams. Could it be that each layer of carbon underground is like a lullaby, a quieting of a former heat, a dimming of a former brightness? Maybe, maybe not. But we know that without this burial, the world would not look as it does now. The sky would be heavier, the oceans warmer, the seasons shorter. Instead, we inherited a planet that had learned how to rest, how to cradle what once was, how to tuck away the past without erasing it. And yet, if carbon can be stored so quietly, so completely, what else might be buried in the folds of deep time? What other traces of breath, of life, of memory, wait below, beneath the coal, sleeping under rain-soaked leaves, waiting to rise again, as rain? And maybe that's just what it did. Maybe, in time, the carbon once buried in forest floors returned, not as coal or ash or stone, but as water, as mist, as vapor pulled upward through stems and stalks, carried by the quiet breathing of leaves. Because somewhere along the long unfolding of life, something miraculous began to happen. The plants, once content to drink rain, began to make it. Not because they meant to, not because they tried, but because leaves do not simply sit beneath the sky. They reach into it. They open tiny mouths, stomata, to draw in carbon dioxide. And through those same mouths, water escapes. It rises. Transpiration, we call it. A soft exhale from the green world, invisible to the eye, but vast in its effect. One tree may lift hundreds of liters of water a day, sending it skyward, molecule by molecule. Multiply that by a forest, a biome, a continent, and the breath of plants becomes weather. Not metaphorically, literally. The rain we see falling is not just ocean evaporate, drifting inland on wind. It is recycled breath. It is exhaled memory. It is the soft aftermath of leaf after leaf after leaf, whispering water back into the air. Could it be, then, that plants taught Earth to rain more wisely? That they stitched sky and soil together in a feedback loop of balance and replenishment? Maybe, maybe not. But in regions where forests thrive, rainfall becomes self-sustaining. Roots draw water, leaves release it, clouds gather, rain falls, and the cycle repeats. In this way, forests are not just part of the climate, they are the climate. They bend it, nurture it, cool it. They conjure clouds, regulate humidity, invite storms where otherwise there might be only sun. And still, it happens so quietly. A stillness made of countless exchanges. One molecule at a time. One breath. One drop. And there is poetry in that, isn't there? That the sky above you may be stitched from the memory of trees? That every drizzle, every misted morning, every rumble of distant thunder, might begin with the gentle flutter of a leaf's unseen breath? Leaves are so much more than surfaces. They are membranes, bridges between matter and vapor, between earth and sky, between the now and the soon. And in their structure, that complex lattice of veins and cells, they carry not just nutrients but intention. They hold the blueprint for rain. In the Amazon, in the Congo, in the great green belts of time, rain does not simply arrive. It is called. It is built. It is released from below. And when deforestation breaks that cycle, rainfall patterns shift. Rivers dry. Clouds scatter. The atmosphere forgets. And so we wonder, could it be that memory, too, falls as rain? That water carries with it the whispers of old forests, old climates, old lives? Could the droplets that land on your skin today be touched by the chemistry of ferns that fossilized before mammals had names? Maybe, maybe not. But the isotopes in rainwater don't lie. They hold signatures, ratios that tell us where the water came from, how long it spent in the atmosphere, what kind of plants helped it rise. It is all connected, and always has been. The leaf, the root, the air, the stone. The rain that falls is not separate from the breath of the world. It is that breath made visible. So the next time you feel it, a drizzle on your shoulder, a drop sliding down your window, you might pause. You might wonder, is this drop a return? Is this the exhale of a leaf long gone? The sigh of a canopy lost to time? Because if leaves make rain, and rain feeds life, and life rises again into leaf, then what we are living in is not weather. It is memory, falling gently back to earth. And if rain falls from leaves, what else might rise through them? What else might the canopy send into the sky, besides water? Could it be that forests were the first to shape clouds? And maybe they were, not with hands or with tools or with thought, but with breath, with rising mist, with tiny particles drifting upward from leaves. The volatile sense of life, invisible and floating, meeting moisture in the air, helping droplets to form, helping clouds to grow. We think of clouds as sky's own doing, as atmosphere and temperature and vapor alone. But what if forests too had a hand in their making? What if the great green below became sculptors of the blue above? Because trees do more than drink water, they release it. They don't just absorb light, they echo it. And in the warm stillness of midday, when the air above a forest begins to shimmer, the canopy begins to breathe upward. Thousands of kilometers of forest, breathing as one. A slow exhale. Transpiration. The sky responds in kind. Clouds gather, not just from evaporation off seas, but from the lungs of leaves. And in this way, the weather is no longer separate from life. It is shaped by it, altered by every tree that opens its pores, every moss that clings to bark, every root that lifts water into wood. A forest is not just on the land, it rises into the air. It becomes atmosphere. It becomes shade. Look closely at a satellite image and you'll see it. Clouds forming in lines over rainforest canopies, curling like white breath over green skin. They do not form randomly. They echo the life below. And when the forest thins, the clouds drift elsewhere. They become quieter, less frequent, less sure. Could it be that trees cast shadows not just on the ground, but into the sky itself? That forests were clouds like veils, moving, forming, dissolving, in quiet conversation with light and air? Maybe, maybe not. But something happens in the presence of trees. Something happens that doesn't happen without them. The particles that rise from leaves, we call them biogenic aerosols, carry the signature of life. They seed clouds. They alter temperature. They affect how sunlight is scattered, how rain is made, how long a storm will last. They're not loud. They're not visible. But they are everywhere forests still breathe. And when forests fall, that signature fades. The sky becomes a little emptier. The weather a little stranger. Rain shifts. Heat lingers longer. The balance changes. Not because the forest stopped existing, but because its conversation with the sky was interrupted. Perhaps weather is not merely a result of pressure systems and jet streams, but of memory. A looping memory of forest breath, of canopy exhale, of ancient transpiration repeating itself with the rhythm of time. And what does a cloud remember as it drifts across a forest that helped form it? What does a shadow mean, cast downward from a shape born from tree breath? We don't know, but we can feel it. On humid days when the sky seems close, when thunder gathers softly, when the air is rich with the scent of leaves, we are inside something older than us, something more rhythmic, something that existed long before windmills and satellites and 7-day forecasts. And in that rhythm, there is something soothing, something slow, a sky that once moved to the breath of leaves, not to the roar of engines, a sky whose clouds came not from concrete, but from moss, from bark, from fern. Is it possible, then, that every cloud carries not just water but memory? That inside each suspended droplet, a leaf once whispered? That forests have been speaking upward for millions of years, and the sky, gently, invisibly, has always replied? Maybe clouds are not just temporary weather. Maybe they're the sky's own version of a forest. Shifting, layered, alive. Maybe the sky learned softness from the trees. Maybe shade began not at the roots, but above them. And if forests build clouds, and clouds cast shadows, then who do those shadows belong to? To the trees? To the air? To the planet itself? Or maybe to no one at all? Maybe shadows are just the earth remembering how to cool itself. And if so, if a cloud is a memory of breath, of life, of green, then what are the forests that turn to stone? What happens when a cloud forms above a forest that no longer exists? Maybe nothing. Maybe the cloud drifts on, unknowing. Or maybe, just maybe, something remembers. Not in the way we remember, with names, with stories, with photographs, but in layers. In silence. In the language of minerals and pressure and time. Because not all forests disappeared. Some sank. Some stayed. Some became stone. Fossil forests are strange things. They do not sway. They do not breathe. But they are still here, not as trees but as translations. Petrified trunks rooted in forgotten soils. Stumps buried beneath ash. Ferns pressed flat into shale like delicate fossils of thought. Ghosts in rock. Whispers in layers. Some forests left nothing but carbon stains. Chemical shadows. The place where life once was, now a trace in black, in gray, in silence. Others are more complete. Forests so perfectly preserved you can still see the bark, the rings, the texture of a branch that hasn't moved in hundreds of millions of years. In Arizona, in Egypt, in Antarctica, entire forests have turned to stone, one molecule at a time. Not because they wanted to be remembered, but because the right conditions held them still. A sudden flood, a volcanic blanket, a burial without air. Decay halted, life paused. And in that pause, something impossible happened, time folded. Could it be that the stone trees we find now are more than fossils? That they are time's way of holding on to something it couldn't quite let go? A chapter too quiet to erase? Maybe. Maybe not. But there's a weight to fossil wood, a density that feels like memory hardened into mass. And what about the forests that left no stone, no print, no echo? The ones erased by erosion, subducted beneath oceans, lost in the molten churn of continents? Forests that cooled the sky, fed the soil, built the carbon beds we now burn, and yet left not even a whisper behind? Could the absence itself be a kind of fossil? A silence we haven't yet learned to read? Geologists search for these absences. They follow isotope trails, look for changes in oxygen ratios, shifts in carbon-13 that hint at a vanished canopy. They read between the lines, between the layers, and sometimes they find something, a pattern too regular to be random, a change too sudden to be natural, a signal without a source. And so we piece together these forgotten forests, like archaeologists of light, reconstructing entire ecosystems from a single frond, pollen grain, a thin band of coal. We map lost continents by what once grew upon them. And yet, the picture is always incomplete, always haunted by what we will never find. But maybe that's part of the beauty, that forests are not just what we see in stone, but also what we feel in the spaces where nothing remains. The way a canyon wall curves where roots once held it firm. The way a cliff crumbles differently because a forest once shaded its soil. The way the sky above a desert still holds a pattern shaped long ago by breath now buried. Fossils remind us that time is not linear. It folds, presses, forgets but not completely. It lets go, but not all at once. And in those folds, in those layers, we find the quiet resistance of life, the persistence of structure, the echo of chlorophyll in stone. So when we find a fossil tree, we're not just looking at a rock. We're looking at the outline of a breath, the impression of a season that never ended, the resting place of a shadow once cast by a leaf that no longer exists. And if that much can be held in silence, if entire forests can be compressed into a shimmer of minerals, then what else might still be hiding, just beneath the surface? What other layers lie buried not in stone, but in entropy, not preserved, but forgotten? And if entire forests can fade into the fabric of Earth without leaving a trace, then how do we know what's real, and what's already been lost? Could it be that memory is not just held in fossils, but in decay itself? Could it be that what vanishes matters just as much as what remains. And if forests can fossilize, what does it mean when decay becomes the beginning of something new? It means that entropy doesn't always destroy. Sometimes it nourishes. Sometimes it remembers. Because when plants fall, when leaves drift to the forest floor, when roots die in the dark, when flowers close for the last time, they do not vanish. Not completely. They begin a different kind of transformation, a soft unraveling, a giving back, a quiet chemistry we call decay, but that the soil knows as renewal. Entropy, in its simplest sense, is the slow slide toward disorder, the tendency of all things to come undone. But in the forest, that undoing is not waste. It's instruction, a redistribution of what once reached for the sky, now feeding what waits below. Dead wood becomes habitat, fallen leaves become a blanket, rot becomes richness, and beneath that richness, something stirs. Fungi, bacteria, insects, tiny workers that do not mourn the loss of structure. They celebrate it, they break it down, they reimagine it, not because they want to, but because they must, because life is not just a forward motion. It loops, it spirals, composts. And compost, strange as it sounds, is a kind of memory, not one we can read with our eyes, but one the earth feels. A chemical archive, a library without letters. In every handful of soil, there are traces of what once was, molecules of ancient rain, atoms from extinct ferns, fragments of roots that cracked through stone. Soil is not just dirt, it is layered time. It is the residue of centuries falling slowly into themselves. And in those layers there is rhythm. The green rises, the green falls, and in falling it becomes food. Could it be that the forest floor is wiser than the canopy? That the ground beneath our feet holds more stories than the treetops ever told? Maybe, maybe not. But when we kneel and press our hands into earth, we're touching entropy that has turned generous. Decay that has become life again. There is no waste in this system. Only return. A fallen branch becomes a nurse log. A pile of leaves becomes the bed for seedlings. Carbon once bound in bark dissolves into humus, into breath, into the roots of something new. And this is where the beauty of green entropy lies, not in the loss, but in the layering. A tree does not simply end. It redistributes itself. It becomes part of the system that once held it. It nourishes the ground that once held its shadow. Even death in the forest feels gentle, slow, participatory, like the plant world has accepted the terms of time, and in doing so, found peace in dissolution. And so we walk through woods that are not only growing, but decaying. And in that decay, there is softness, a scent, a texture, a quiet that reminds us that everything we see is temporary, but not gone, just changing, just returning, just rejoining the loop. What if this is what memory really is? Not a perfect preservation, but a composting of moments, of structures, of selves. Could it be that to remember the earth lets go, that to grow the forest must fall? And if entropy feeds the green, then what does the green become when entropy pauses? When the cycle is frozen, suspended, preserved? Could it be that under the right conditions even decay can leave a fossil? Even rot can become stone? Even the mess of falling leaves can become a map? And if that's true, if even decay can endure, then what might lie beneath the layers we have yet to disturb? What might wait in the hush beneath a soil older than language? Older than us? And what might it whisper when we finally begin to listen? Maybe it would whisper about light. Not the kind that dances or dazzles, but the kind that lingers. The kind that lands on a leaf and does not leave. Because forests do not simply grow beneath sunlight, they change it. Quietly, systematically, with every canopy, every shade, every shifting green. Long ago, before trees stretched into the sky, the earth looked different from space. Brighter, paler. Light bounced off open land, off rock, off ice and bare soil. The planet shone in full reflectivity, sending sunlight back into the cosmos like a mirror. But mirrors do not hold. They deflect. They preserve nothing. They remember nothing. Then, slowly, forests came. And the forests were dark. They were deep. They pulled light into themselves. Not to hide it, but to use it. To turn it into sugar, into breath, into structure. And in doing so, they changed the Earth's albedo, the fraction of solar energy reflected away. The planet dimmed. Not in brightness, but in mood. It began to absorb more, to retain more, to metabolize sunlight instead of merely returning it. Could it be that forests gave Earth the power to hold light? Not just physically, but emotionally, the way a shadow holds memory, the way green holds stillness. Maybe, maybe not. But what we know is this. Ancient canopies filtered the sun, sifted wavelengths, altered how energy moved across the surface of the world. Some wavelengths were absorbed, others were scattered. Forests don't reflect light evenly, they select. Green plants reflect green because they don't need it. The rest they gather, they keep, they turn into movement and form and time. Imagine standing beneath a carboniferous forest. Ferns the size of houses, lycopods with trunks like pillars, a sky veiled by foliage so thick it reshaped the very heat beneath it. Sunlight entered, but it didn't bounce back out. It was slowed, diffused, caught in leaves, in bark, in the air made damp with breath. And this changes everything, because the light that is held is not the same as the light that is reflected. One cools, the other warms. One says no, the other says yes. Could it be, then, that forests helped regulate not just carbon but climate through this quiet manipulation of light? That the canopy itself, its color, its thickness, its geometry, became a thermostat the planet came to rely on? Maybe we think of leaves too simply, as flat, as decorative, as momentary. But a leaf is an optical device, a sensor, a filter. It lets in only what it needs and gives the rest back in form of color, of shade, of signal. And collectively, billions of these decisions shape the Earth's relationship with the sun. And when forests spread, across equatorial belts, up ancient mountainsides, into once barren lands, they didn't just cover the Earth, they cooled it. They softened the blow of solar intensity. They held the heat when it mattered, and gave it back as needed. We see it in the data. Forested regions absorb more sunlight, but they also create their own clouds, bounce back infrared differently, alter surface temperatures in complex and beautiful ways. They are not passive. They are engineers. And still, no one sees it happening. We walk through woods and feel the shade. We speak of shadows, of coolness, of dappled light. But we rarely think about the sky above and how it's responding. About how much more the Earth is absorbing, because the forest said yes. Could it be that forests are the memory of ancient light? That within their patterns, their veins, their pigments, their angles, there is a code written in photon and breath? That light, once captured by a leaf, never really leaves at all? Even fossil forests, petrified and buried, still carry spectral echoes in the mineral record, signatures of the light they once filtered, the wavelengths they preferred. Geologists trace these through iron bands, through carbon isotopes, through the reflectivity of ancient sediments. Even without photosynthesis, the fingerprint of light remains. And if forests shaped the sky's albedo, its reflective personality, then what happens when forests are removed? Does the planet forget how to hold light? Does it become a mirror again? Does it become cold? Or bright? Or simply confused? Entropy doesn't just wear things down. It erases patterns. It loosens memory. And light, once scattered, is difficult to gather again. So we ask, what happens to a planet that once held light in its skin, but now sheds it too quickly? What happens to a memory when the canopy that caught it is gone? And if light can be caught, filtered, changed, what other forms of energy might the forest once have shaped? What else passed through the green and came out transformed? Perhaps time itself, because deep in the Carboniferous the world breathed differently. The air was thicker, wetter, almost syruped with oxygen. And in this denser sky, long before petals bloomed or bees hummed, there was a forest unlike any we've seen since. A forest not of flowers, but of fractals. A realm where ferns ruled, not curled beneath trees, but as trees. Towering, massive, unfolding in perfect, repeating spirals like green algorithms encoded in silence. This was a world of spores, not seeds. Of dampness, not dryness. No fruits. No colors to seduce pollinators. Just primitive precision. Geometry made lush. The great tree ferns, the lycophytes, the horsetails, they didn't need flowers. They had form. They had pattern. They had height. Some grew over 30 meters tall, their feathered crowns sifting light in a world more twilight than day. Imagine walking beneath them. The ground slick with peat, soft with rot. The air thick with mist and the scent of living wood. Above, no canopy in the modern sense. Just layer after layer of frond, fanned out like the ribs of an enormous sleeping animal. There is no birdsong here. No mammals, no seeds rattling in the wind. Just the hush of spores released in clouds, the slow drip of condensation, the rhythm of rain before rivers found their names. And what a breath the earth took then. With so much oxygen rising from these fern-thick worlds, even the insects grew enormous. Dragonflies the size of hawks, millipedes longer than a child. Life expanded not in complexity but in scale. It was as if the planet had exhaled too much, and everything grew large to hold the air. Could it be that the geometry of ferns wasn't just functional, but poetic? That the spiral of a frond was a kind of writing? A looping record of sunlight and shadow and the time between rains? Maybe, maybe not. But the repetition has meaning. Fractals echo through nature. In waves, in rivers, in lungs, in roots. And here, in the age of ferns, they reached a kind of early climax. And yet, for all their grandeur, these forests were fragile. They depended on water, on humidity, on near-constant moisture. Without it, their reproduction failed. Their spores dried. Their forms collapsed. So they clung to swamps, to floodplains, to warm coastal belts. Places where time moved slowly, where sediment buried things gently, and where decay could lead to preservation. It's in these ancient wetlands that much of the planet's coal was born. These ferns, when they fell, did not vanish. They layered. They compressed. They became carbon. Not because they meant to, but because entropy took its time. The kings of the Carboniferous became its memory, held deep underground. Their breath, their form, their shadows, all turned to fuel before anyone was there to see it burn. And so we ask, what does it mean to be forgotten, and yet essential? What does it mean to have shaped a world, but left behind no flowers, no songs, no stories? Only dust, only fossils, only seams of black stone that we mine and burn, unaware that what we hold in our hands was once a fractal tower swaying in the oxygen-heavy wind. Could it be that the ferns are still with us, not in their towering form, but in the quiet persistence of pattern? In the spiral of a nautilus, in the veins of a leaf, in the curl of a sleeping child's hair? That somewhere, deep in the design of living things, the forest that once ruled is still whispering. Maybe, maybe not. But the fossil record does not lie. It holds the mark of a time when flowers did not yet exist, and the world did just fine without them. And if nature could once rise to such beauty without color, without scent, without sweetness, then what other forms of beauty have we forgotten to see? What other kings have passed, unrecognized, unremembered, beneath our feet? And if even ferns had their age, what came after them, to bury them in bloom? Maybe it wasn't just flowers. Maybe it was something stranger, not in color or shape but in record, in what was left behind. Because not all fossils are bones or bark. Some are signals. Some are whispers in the layers. And some feel like messages not meant for us but still somehow received. The term technofossil belongs to us now, to plastics and alloys and the buried architectures of our machines. But what if we weren't the first to encode a memory in matter? What if ancient plants, long before petals opened or pollinators arrived, were already leaving behind biological signatures so resistant, so complex, so deliberate in structure, that they too could be called a kind of technology? Lignin, one of the most stubborn molecules Earth has ever known. A tough, aromatic polymer. It strengthened early plants, gave them rigidity, helped them rise into light. It made wood possible. It made forests possible. And yet, it came with a strange side effect. It resisted decay. For tens of millions of years, nothing knew how to break it down. Bacteria couldn't eat it. Fungi hadn't yet evolved the enzymes. So lignin piled up. Forests fell and weren't digested. Trees died and weren't erased. Layer after layer of undecayed carbon sank into swamp and mire. And in doing so, they wrote a strange chapter of history, one in which a molecular invention outpaced nature's ability to forget. Could it be that lignin is a kind of technofossil? Not in the artificial sense, but in the sense of being engineered not by intention but by adaptation. A molecule crafted by evolution to solve a problem, support, structure, growth, and in doing so, it left behind a physical trace far more durable than its creators. And then there are spores. Tiny, nearly indestructible. Walls of sporopollenin, one of the most chemically stable compounds in the biological world. Spores fell like dust, floated on wind, settled into sediment. They mark layers of rock like timestamps, different shapes for different plants, different textures, different arrangements. To us, they look like static, like noise. But to geology, to palynology, the science of ancient pollen, they are language, sequence, signal. Could these spore patterns be seen as early codes? Not in binary, but in biology. Not to be read in lines, but in clusters and shifts and absences. Maybe, maybe not. But when we pull core samples from lake beds, from peat bogs, from ancient marine shelves, we find spores, intact, unchanged, waiting for us to notice, waiting to be counted, compared, interpreted. And interpretation is a kind of memory, one that asks, what was this world like when these spores were new? What forests stood here? What climates drifted above? What grew, what fell, what lingered? In this way, early plants left more than themselves behind. They left systems, patterns, residues, molecules that shaped Earth's geochemistry long after their bodies were gone. The coal beds, the lignin locks, the spore clouds sealed in rock. These are more than remnants. They are artifacts of interaction, artifacts of evolution moving faster than decay. And so we begin to see the forest not just as life, but as infrastructure, as builder, as broadcaster, as keeper of form and chemistry and delay. Maybe the first technosphere wasn't made of metal. Maybe it was made of moss. And if that's true, if early flora built something deeper than shadow and root, then what else might be hidden in the molecular archive of stone? Could it be that Earth holds layers of information not yet deciphered? Fossilized blueprints not of machines, but of metabolism? Could spores and lignin and cellulose be part of an ancient syntax? A slow biological encryption waiting to be understood? Maybe, maybe not. But if so, then what we call fossils may not be the past at all. They may be instructions. And if instructions can sleep inside rock, then what else might be encoded in the roots beneath our feet? What other systems lie buried? Not in cities, but in sediment. Maybe the most ancient systems were never built above the ground at all. Maybe they spread downward, branching into darkness, into quiet, into touch. Because while trunks rose and leaves opened and light passed through green, something else was happening beneath the forest floor. Something slower, something older, something that didn't need eyes or air to know where it was going. Roots. We often think of them as anchors, as straws, as simple structures reaching for water. But roots do more than hold. They feel. They follow. They remember. They connect. In the hush beneath the canopy, below the reach of light, a silent network pulses. Not with blood. Not with electricity. But with molecules, subtle signals passed from root to root, from fungi to fiber, from tree to tree. Hormones, enzymes, electrical gradients, chemical trails. This isn't metaphor. It's real. Trees share warnings. They send sugars. They alter the chemistry of the soil around them depending on who their neighbors are. Kin, stranger, or enemy. Through the tangled web of the mycorrhizal network, roots and fungi co-author the story of the forest. Could it be that what we walk above is not just a forest floor, but the surface of a thinking structure? A diffuse intelligence that spreads, that senses, that reacts not in seconds but in seasons? Maybe, maybe not. But the signals are there, measurable, mapped, and the first roots long ago may have started this conversation. Not with language but with chemistry. Early vascular plants developed rhizomes and shallow tendrils, pushing tentatively into the ground. But as forests grew taller, their foundations grew deeper. Roots wrapped around rocks, found water hidden in fracture lines, met others in the dark and didn't always retreat. Fossilized root traces called rhizoliths record these early journeys. In petrified soils from hundreds of millions of years ago, we can still see the outlines of ancient connections. Some solitary, some clustered, some branching out in ways that suggest avoidance or attraction, or something in between. And with each passing epoch, the network became more complex. Fungi partnered with roots, forming the vast mycorrhizal webs that now stitch together nearly all forests. Thin strands called hyphae link plants like threads in a loom. They ferry nutrients, relay messages, respond to wounds. This is not consciousness, but it is communication, not fast, but persistent. Could we call it a kind of nervous system? A planetary one? Not in structure but in purpose, in the way it senses, adjusts, coordinates. Could it be that the forest as a whole has awareness? Not self-awareness, but world awareness. Science suggests this network responds to damage, to drought, to change. That trees under attack by insects send out chemical signals to warn their neighbors. That wounded roots alter their exudates. That fungal partners shift their priorities in real time. And these pulses, faint, chemical, rhythmic, echo beneath us, whether we hear them or not. So what do they carry? What do they hold? What ancient instincts pass through these hidden corridors of life? Maybe they hold nothing. Maybe it's all just reaction. A slow, natural choreography of growth and survival. Or maybe these pulses are memories, not of moments but of conditions, of light, of water, of stress. Maybe trees remember droughts in their rings, but in their roots, they remember differently. As caution, as response. And if a forest can hold memory underground, then what happens when it stretches across continents? When root systems and fungal threads span thousands of kilometers? When breath and soil are linked not by distance, but by signal? Could it be that the forest has always been more than the sum of its trees? That it is not a collection, but a body? That it doesn't just grow, it feels? And if so, what else might it know? What might it sense when we walk above it, unaware? And if this underground pulse, this soft, invisible rhythm, truly is the whisper of a living system, then what happens when that rhythm is interrupted? When trees are cut, when roots are severed, when networks fall silent, does the forest forget? Or does it remember the loss forever? And if memory can move without neurons, if a message can pass through silence, then what other kinds of intelligence might be hiding in plain sight among the green? Perhaps the kind that lives in color, the kind that doesn't move or speak, but responds not to sound, but to light. And not just any light, a very specific spectrum, a narrow slice of the sun's voice, because chlorophyll, the pigment that makes almost all plants green, doesn't use green. It rejects it, reflects it, sends it back out into the world as if to say, not this, not now, not needed. And this raises a question so basic we often forget to ask it. Why green? Why not black to absorb all wavelengths? Or white to reflect and protect? Why this particular shimmer? This soft, sleeping emerald that covers most of the land on Earth? Could it be that green is not just the result of biology, but the result of choice? Of evolution negotiating with entropy, refining the rules of energy one photon at a time? Maybe, maybe not. But we know this much: chlorophyll is selective. Captures blue, captures red. It leaves green behind. And this, scientists say, is not inefficiency. It's balance. A compromise between energy and safety, between power and damage. Because blue light is rich in energy but it can harm. Red light is abundant but low in strength. And green? Green is somewhere in the middle. Strong, but not too strong. Scarce, but not too scarce. And so chlorophyll lets it go. Not because it can't use it, but because it doesn't need to. Not yet. And this simple act of reflecting one part of the spectrum shaped the color of the world. The first plants may not have been truly green. They may have been purple, red, even black. But chlorophyll, once it arrived, outperformed them. Not through conquest, but through refinement. It mastered photosynthesis in a form that balanced sunlight with survival. And so it spread, quietly, steadily, like breath across time. Could it be that the earth is green not by accident but by design? That chlorophyll is the most elegant solution to the problem of starlight? That in choosing which light to absorb, plants also chose how the planet would look. From above, from space, from memory. We now use satellites to scan for green. We map it, measure it, monitor it for loss, for change, for drought and growth and stress. But the plants themselves do not care for being watched. They simply continue, catching photons, moving electrons, powering sugars. Even now, after billions of years, the system remains mostly the same. The molecules that first made oxygen from light are still at work, in blades of grass, in forest canopies, in algae drifting through ancient seas. And yet, why stop at green? Why hasn't evolution pushed further? Found pigments that use more of the spectrum? That reflect less? Convert more? Maybe it tried. Maybe it still does. Some plants have accessory pigments, carotenoids, anthocyanins, that let them shift, shimmer, adapt. But chlorophyll remains the core. The old idea. The elegant one. Perhaps that's because energy is not the only currency. Maybe safety matters. Maybe temperature, water, shade, chemistry, all the delicate threads of living systems, rely on that specific compromise chlorophyll made so long ago. Or perhaps green is more than function. Perhaps it is signal. To us, green means growth, calm, fertility. But to a planet, could it be a kind of dreaming? A way of balancing solar pressure with biological breath? A slow, planetary exhale made visible? What if every leaf is a kind of eye, not seeing but choosing? A membrane of decision, tuned to the rhythm of light and time and season? And if that's true, then what does a forest dream about as it sleeps in sunlight? Does it remember its red ancestors? Does it wonder why it still lets green go? Does it feel the photons that pass through unused? Maybe chlorophyll is not just a pigment. Maybe it's a philosophy. And if pigment can be that precise, what else might the forest be measuring, quietly, continuously, without us ever knowing? Maybe something as small as moss. Something ancient. Something almost silent. Because while towering trees often catch the eye and chlorophyll dazzles in its precision, there is another green that lingers low to the ground. It does not rise. It does not bloom. It simply covers, clings, cushions, breathes. Mosses, the quiet skin of the earth. Before forests reach toward the sky, before roots learned to crack rock and leaves filtered light in elaborate patterns, there was moss. Simple, primitive, persistent. It crept across stone like memory returning after a long forgetting. Not in waves but in films, in mats, in moist, shaded corners where water lingered and sunlight softened. Could it be that moss was the planet's first blanket? Not just a covering but a regulator? A moderator of temperature, of water, of time? Maybe, maybe not. But evidence suggests that early mosses played a role in one of Earth's most dramatic shifts. A cooling so profound it changed the direction of life. About 470 million years ago, during the Ordovician period, the first land plants, mostly mosses and liverworts, began spreading across barren rock. They had no true roots, no flowers, no seeds. Just the will to cover, to hold moisture, to breathe just enough. But even in their simplicity they had power. Mosses absorb carbon dioxide directly through their surfaces. They weather rock by releasing acids. They trap dust. They trap rain. And in doing so, they help draw carbon from the sky into the ground. not with drama, but with patience. Over time, this carbon drawdown cooled the atmosphere. Ice spread. Climates shifted. Entire ecosystems evolved to adjust. Not because moss is meant to change the world, but because persistence is a force of its own. Even now, moss continues its quiet work. On rooftops, on forest floors, in tundra and taiga, in peat bogs where it accumulates, layer upon layer, trapping carbon so deeply it can remain undisturbed for thousands of years. And when scientists core down into those bogs, they read moss like a diary. Pollen grains, isotope ratios, traces of volcanic ash, records of rainfall, of fire, of drought. Moss is not just soft, it is archival. A velvet library of ancient weather. Could it be that moss remembers more than we do? That within each darkened layer lies a version of the earth we've long since forgotten? Not because it was erased, but because we never thought to ask the moss what it knew. Maybe the humility of moss is what made it so enduring. It doesn't rise above others. It grows where it is allowed. It thrives in shade, in margins, in places too extreme for most. And it asks for so little, just moisture, just stillness. And yet, if moss were to vanish, entire systems would falter. Forests rely on it to retain water. Insects use it for shelter. Birds weave it into nests. In cold climates, it insulates the soil. In warm ones, it shields from erosion. Not because it was designed to do so, but because it simply stayed long enough to matter. Could it be that the earth, in times of imbalance, turns back to moss? That when climates warm and ecosystems strain, the small, the ancient, the low to the ground might return to restore what was once held? Already we see this. In rewilding projects. In tundra research. In the slow recovery of peatlands damaged by fire or cut for fuel. Moss returns first. It always returns first. And so we wonder, what if moss is the fallback system of the biosphere? The plan not written, but remembered? What if, when complexity fails, simplicity waits, patient, quiet, green? And if moss can cool the world, trap the sky, record the centuries, what else might it be waiting to do? What memories lie pressed beneath its softness, still untouched? And if memory can be held in something so small, what might that mean for the rest of us? Those of us always reaching up, while forgetting to look down at the green that never left? And if moss remembers the sky, what did it once feel? When ice touched the edges of continents, and snow met stone, and time slowed into frost? Maybe it felt like breath being held. Not in fear, but in calibration, the long, slow pause of a planet adjusting itself. Because Earth is not static. It listens. It learns. It shifts its own balance when something tips too far. And long before machines measured the heat or maps charted the storms, it was plants soft, green, unspoken, that took on the task of cooling the world, not through force but through absorption, through burial, through stillness. Carbon drawdown, we call it now, a phrase that feels mechanical but is rooted in something deeply alive. Leaves pulling carbon from the sky not out of duty, but by design. Roots locking it into soil. Forests falling and folding, layering themselves into sediment, again and again. A quiet sequestration. A surrender. The atmosphere once held far more carbon than it does today. Thick with greenhouse gases, Earth sweltered under a heavy, ancient breath. But with the arrival of vascular plants, and their deepening roots, their growing canopies, their wilting and return, that breath was pulled downward, trapped in peat, stored in stone, tucked away in coal seams and carbonates. Could it be that Earth learned from its own forested skin? That the biosphere taught the planet how to regulate itself, not in real time but in deep time? Maybe, maybe not. But the geologic record shows the pattern. Plant life rises, atmospheric carbon falls, temperatures drop, glaciers spread. This wasn't always gentle. The cooling came with ice ages, with extinctions, with landscapes frozen beneath snow for millennia. But still, it was balance. Not static, but dynamic. A system of feedbacks nested within feedbacks. Forests shaping clouds. Clouds shaping temperature. Temperature shaping what could grow and where and for how long. In this sense, Earth became its own thermostat. Not because it planned to, but because life participated in the loop. Because every breath exhaled by a tree, every molecule of CO2 taken in by a leaf, every drop of water lifted into air by transpiration, changed the whole. And yet not without cost. Because for every pulse of green that cooled the sky, there was a pulse of silence beneath it. A loss, a burial. Plants die, they fall. They feed the next, yes, but some are taken deeper. Subducted, pressed, forgotten, and the memory of what once breathed becomes locked away, inaccessible, until something breaks the seal. Could it be that Earth's ability to cool itself depends on forgetting? That in order to draw down carbon, the planet must also bury stories of ecosystems, of sunlight, of entire epochs folded into stone? Entropy plays its part. It decomposes, scatters, layers. But in certain conditions it preserves instead. A forest becomes coal. A bog becomes peat. A breath becomes a future flame. And here lies the tension. Because what cooled the earth also stored power. What stabilized the air also built up pressure underground. Carbon saved is carbon banked. And the longer it sleeps, the more dangerous its awakening. Could we have known that when we began to burn those forests again? Not the ones we see, but the ones long buried, the ones we never knew, we would unwrite the balance? Release in centuries what took millions of years to fold away. Maybe Earth learned to cool itself not just through plants, but through patience, through slow adjustment, through cycles too wide for us to see. And if that's true, then what happens when patience is interrupted? When drawdown becomes discharge? When the air begins to remember what it once forgot? Already we see the feedback loops fray. Permafrost melting, peatlands drying, forests burning. What was once storage is becoming signal again. What was once quiet is becoming noise. And still the plants breathe. Still they try. Maybe they always will. Maybe life adapts even now. Maybe moss returns. Maybe leaves learn new rhythms. Maybe something we cannot yet imagine will grow to meet the heat. Or maybe not. But if Earth once learned to cool itself, then perhaps it remembers how. And if the memory is buried, maybe the forest still carries it. Not in trunks or crowns, but in roots, in seeds, in the silent waiting that happens just before the rain returns. And if that memory could speak, it might ask something quiet, something old, something we've heard before but haven't yet answered. What happens to a system that forgets how to hold its own breath? Maybe it pauses, maybe it resets, maybe it waits for something old to return. Because long before we built machines, long before roads carved through canopies, long before the word deforestation belonged to us, the forests vanished. And they didn't just vanish once. They vanished again and again, quietly, without chainsaws, without fire, without intention. We often imagine nature as something steady, resilient, restorative, and it is. But it is also vulnerable to itself, to change, to time. Some forests collapsed not from axes or cities, but from within, through climate, through imbalance, through the slow drift of conditions falling out of rhythm with the life they once supported. One of the earliest extinctions of forests came at the end of the Devonian period, over 360 million years ago. A time when plants were rising, tall, vascular, ambitious. Roots were deepening, drawing minerals from the rock. Leaves were expanding, taking more carbon from the sky. Forests spread across the land like memory gaining confidence. And the earth responded. Oxygen rose. Carbon fell. The climate cooled. Too much. Could it be that plants triggered their own decline? That the forests of the Devonian, in changing the air, changed their own fate? It's possible. The drawdown of carbon may have led to global cooling. Ice spread. Ecosystems faltered. Soil, once held by roots, was lost to erosion. And forests that had just begun ended. And yet, they were not alone. Again in the Permian. Again in the Triassic. Again in the Paleocene. Great forested realms blinked out across the ages. Not because of us, but because of Earth's own long breath. Volcanic winters, shifting atmospheres, changing rainfall, Entire lineages of plants gone. Some left fossils. Some left coal. Some left nothing at all. Not because they were weak, but because nothing lasts forever, not even the green. Could it be that extinction is part of the forest's rhythm? That even nature, in all her patience, sometimes undoes herself? Maybe not out of failure. Maybe out of reset. Maybe forests do not end. Maybe they fold. Into soil. Into stone. Into the seeds of what comes next. We see it in the fossil record. Buried trunks, pollen transitions, sudden absences followed by slow reappearances. Fern here. Conifer there. Then silence. Then moss returning. Then something new. Could it be that forests are not only ecosystems, but experiments? Trials in balance. Lessons in resilience. Not all of them succeed. Not all are meant to. And yet, each one teaches the earth something. About carbon. About water. About light. About time. So when we speak of deforestation today, we often think of human hands. And rightly so. But deep beneath our feet, the story is older. There are ghosts of forests we never knew. Forests erased not by axes, but by atmosphere. And this should make us pause. Because if nature can undo herself, then what happens when she is pushed? What happens when collapse comes not from the slow dance of feedback loops, but from a sudden silence of too many roots gone at once? Entropy has always waited. But it was once gradual. Now it is fast. Still, the record reminds us collapse is not new. But recovery takes time. Millions of years. Entire epochs. And we have not given time that gift. Not yet. Could it be that the forests we lose today are not the first, but they may be the ones least able to return? Maybe. Maybe not. But if even the Devonian giants could fall, then no forest is immune. And if nature has erased herself before, what else might she erase? To begin again. And in that space, that strange stillness between the fall and the next growth, what grows first? What lingers longest? What has the patience to return after the silence? Maybe nothing returns exactly. Maybe what comes back isn't what was lost, but a shadow of it. A resonance. A silhouette drawn in minerals, not memories. Because some forests, the earliest, the strangest, never fossilized. Never left trunks turned to stone or leaf impressions pressed into shale. Instead, they vanished. Almost completely. And yet, not entirely. There are hints. Faint. Incomplete. Like voices carried across deep time and muffled by the rock. Geologists call them isotopic anomalies. Shifts in the ratios of carbon, oxygen, and sulfur found in sediment layers. Ratios that whisper. Something changed here. Something once grew here. Something once pulled carbon from the air, cast shade on the ground, sent roots into the cooling crust, and then disappeared. Could it be that the first forests were too soft for the fossil record? That they lived and died in places where sediment did not seal them in, where pressure did not preserve them, where time moved on without remembering their names? Maybe, maybe not. But what we do know is this. There are layers of Earth's surface that bear the signature of forests we've never seen. The Devonian period, again and again, offers such puzzles. Before the great tree-sized lycophytes, before fern-like giants left coal and bone, there were smaller, stranger plants. Thread-like. Fungi. Sometimes vascular, sometimes not. Protoplants. Pre-forests. And in certain rock beds, those formed in ancient floodplains or beneath vanished lakes, we find mineral patterns that do not match the world that came before. Increased weathering. Changes in soil chemistry. The subtle fingerprint of roots that once dissolved rock. Not fossil roots. Not visible. But their effect remains. Could a forest leave behind only its shadow? Not a cast one. But a chemical one? Perhaps. Because not all traces are physical. Some are relational. What lived? What changed? What no longer came after? And when researchers drill deep into core samples, sometimes they find an odd layer. Not coal. Not peat. But a shift. A layer rich in certain elements. Low in others. A pause. A strange breath in the rhythm of the strata. Could this be the footprint of a forgotten ecosystem? A forest that grew in conditions we no longer understand. Too wet, too warm, too temporary, and collapsed before it could be remembered? It's possible. Maybe even likely. But without fossils, we are left with ghosts. And ghosts, in geology, are things inferred but not confirmed. The strange, the subtle, the not quite there. And still, they speak. Could it be that these ghost forests changed the climate, even if they left no trees behind? That they took in carbon, cooled the earth, altered rainfall, and then, when they died, triggered warming again? The feedback loops don't care if we remember. They only care that the cycle ran. That breath was drawn, and breath was lost. That light touched green, and green fell into silence. But we wonder, can something be real if it left no bones? Can we call it a forest if it left no stumps? Can memory be true if it's only written in isotopes and erosion patterns? Maybe. Maybe not. But Earth's history is full of such phantoms. Time moves like a tide. It leaves things stranded, then sweeps them away. And sometimes what's left behind is not what happened, but what changed because of it. A hint, a scar, a shift in the pattern. And if that's all we have, then maybe it's enough. Maybe the ghosts of the protoforests still shape the world, even in absence. Maybe the land remembers through chemistry what it forgot in form. And if memory can be mineral, then what other stories might be hidden in the composition of stone? What else might we have missed, simply because it left no shape behind? And if the first forests vanished without a trace, how many more might have come and gone, without ever being known? And yet, if this much can be lost, what else might we have forgotten? Perhaps the very idea of color. Not the kind we see now, vivid and known, but the kind that once emerged before eyes had ever evolved to witness it. The kind that rose from cells like song from silence, not to be admired, but simply because it could. Because light was there, and life had learned to catch it in more ways than one. In the earliest plants, color was never decoration. It was chemistry. It was purpose. Pigments like anthocyanins and carotenoids appeared quietly, layered beneath or beside the green of chlorophyll. Not to dazzle, not to signal, but to shield, to balance, to survive. Some pigments protected plants from UV radiation. Others buffered light stress, warded off microbes, or stored antioxidant power in their folds. Reds, yellows, deep purples. Not because anyone was watching, but because sunlight was complex. Could it be that color evolved first not as appearance but as behavior? Not to be seen but to do? Maybe, maybe not. But for millions of years, Earth's landscapes were likely rich with pigments that no creature understood. Entire worlds of color, blooming quietly into a sightless silence. And yet, the beauty was real, even when there were no eyes to name it. We often tie color to perception. The flutter of a butterfly wing, the glint of a hummingbird throat, the blush of a sunset caught by a curious gaze. But color existed long before perception. It emerged as a property of light and matter, an interaction of photons and molecules, a reflection, an absorption, a silence turned visible. And plants were among the first to wield it with intention. Petals came later, but pigment was already old. Could it be that Earth looked colorful before it looked alive? That hillsides shimmered with chemical hues long before vision was born to describe them? Even now, some colors in plants are invisible to us. They exist in spectra only insects can see. Ultraviolet roadmaps etched on petals to guide the smallest visitors. To us, a daisy is white. To a bee, it is patterned. Target. A sign. So who is color for? Is it for the plant? The pollinator? The observer? Or is it simply an artifact of energy, a byproduct of living close to the sun? Maybe color isn't about sight at all. Maybe it's about temperature, about stress, about signals passed between cells. A language we were never meant to read, but that, occasionally, we do. And what about the colors that come not in bloom, but in death? Autumn. The moment chlorophyll breaks down, and the deeper pigments emerge. The reds and golds that were always there, just hidden beneath the green. Could it be that every leaf carries a secret color, waiting for its last breath to show it? That the forest is not just seasonal but layered like memory, with things that only appear when the end is near? And if that's true, what is the color of memory itself? Some fossil leaves preserve their pigments, locked in clay and time. Some ancient spores still carry traces of carotenoids. There is a kind of archaeology to color, fragile, partial, soft. And yet it lingers. And so we walk through forests of today, unaware that we are inside an ancient experiment in light. That every petal, every blade, every burst of fruit is built from billions of years of pigment learning to reflect, to protect, to attract, to hide. Plants gave Earth more than oxygen. They gave it visual texture. They taught the land how to catch the sun, not just in energy, but in expression. Because light, when filtered through life, wants to become something more. And if color came before vision, then what else came before sense? What else bloomed before anything could feel it? And if petals painted the air with intention, who were they calling before the wings arrived? Long before flowers, long before leaves, long before even the shape of forests, there were roots, and just beneath them something older still. Thin, pale threads threading through darkness. Not roots, not plants, not quite animal either. Fungi, not as we know them today. Not in mushrooms, not in rot, not in meals, but in networks, endless, hidden networks. What if the forest didn't begin with trees? What if it began with a quiet handshake, beneath the soil, before there was even soil to speak of? Imagine a barren land, crusted by volcanic ash and the slow collapse of rock. No humus, no decay, no leaf litter, just mineral, cold, fragmented stone. And into that emptiness came the fungal filaments, spores blown from ancient ancestors, scattered like whispers across the basalt plains. Looking, searching, touching. They couldn't photosynthesize. They had no chloroplasts, no sun-catching pigments. But they had something else, patience. The ability to reach, to thread, to connect, to wait. And when the first roots found them, when those primitive land plants stretched downward in search of help, they didn't just tap into the fungi. They merged, not in conquest, but in covenant. Could it be that Earth's first revolution wasn't loud at all, but silent? Not in towering growth or bursts of bloom, but in the invisible union of two beings who learned how to share. Fungi fed the plants with phosphorus, with nitrogen, with minerals scraped from the bones of Earth itself. And the plants, they gave sugar, glucose spun from sunlight, not because either needed to, but because something in the exchange made both stronger. And over millions of years, the partnership deepened. The fungi didn't just link with roots, they linked roots to each other. They formed vast mycorrhizal networks, living maps of trade and signal, arcing through the subsurface like thoughts through a nervous system. Some trees, even now, are born with their roots already inoculated. Born into a network, not as individuals but as parts of a greater, whispering whole. Could it be that forests are not just communities of trees, but fungal minds wearing green? Scientists call it the wood wide web. But the truth may be deeper still. Because this wasn't just utility. It was intimacy. Some of these fungi, like the arbuscular mycorrhizae, form tree-like structures inside the root cells of plants. Intimate architecture. Not invasion, but invitation. A cohabitation etched into the blueprint of life. And they've been doing this for over 400 million years. Older than flowers. Older than insects. Older even than the earliest vertebrate bones. Is it possible that this fungal-plant alliance shaped the Earth more profoundly than any single organism ever could? Not because it conquered, but because it cooperated. Fungi helped roots break stone. They made soil where none existed. They cycled nutrients. They connected trees across species, across age, across space. Saplings fed by elders. Sick trees warned of drought. Old giants sharing carbon with younger kin. All through threads too fine to see. All through channels we're only beginning to understand. And yet, this revolution was silent. There is no fossil of the mycorrhizal handshake. No monument to the first spore who reached the first root. The evidence is fragmentary. Traces in Devonian rocks, ghostly isotopes, shadows of hyphae. But the consequence is everything we walk upon. The forests, the soils, the fields that feed us, all resting on the shoulders of a union that did not shout, but whispered. Not because it had to, but because it could. Because in the stillness beneath our feet, life found a new way to rise. And if fungi and plants could collaborate like this, what else might have partnered, unseen? What other packs shaped the early earth, only to dissolve into the dust of deep time? Maybe this wasn't the only silent revolution. Maybe, buried deeper still, there are more covenants. Forgotten, lost, and yet, if this one remains, woven into every forest, every root, every breath, then perhaps others still echo through the stones. And perhaps the land remembers more than we think. Some memories, though, do not stay in stone. They flutter down gently. They dissolve. They drift. The first leaf to fall may not have made a sound, but it left a mark. Not in the fossil record, not in iron or ash, but in rhythm. There was a time when plants held their green all year. Evergreen was not a type, but the default. To keep, to persist, to never let go. But then, something changed. Maybe the climate shifted. Maybe drought grew more frequent. Maybe cold crept in across the higher latitudes. And some trees, only a few at first, began to make a strange choice. They dropped their leaves, not out of decay, but as a strategy, as a whisper of adaptation, letting go before the frost could take them, letting go to survive. Could it be that this was the first memory of a season? A kind of biological clock starting to tick. Not time as hours, but time as light, as loss, as cycles of letting go and waiting. And so began the age of deciduous trees. They built pigments into their final days, not to mourn, but to manage. Carotenoids and anthocyanins flushed through the dying leaves. Reds and yellows that weren't just beautiful. They were protective. Shielding cells, scavenging toxins, conserving nutrients for the long sleep ahead. And those leaves, loosened from their stems, tumbled into the wind. They landed softly, layering riverbanks, forest floors, gentle hollows. And there they began to rot, not because they failed, but because they succeeded, because their decay became nourishment, because their death became soil. The fall of leaves became a ritual, a seasonal sediment, a thin, rustling blanket reminding the land of its own past. And the rivers carried some of them away. Leaf litter drifting into deltas, sinking into peat beds, mingling with the breath of fungi and the slow passage of rain. Some of it fossilized, some of it vanished, but all of it remembered. Is it possible that the first deciduous trees were the first artists of impermanence? That their falling leaves were not loss, but inscription? A writing down of sunlight in a new language of rhythm and retreat? The forest began to pulse. Not just with life, but with pattern, with season, with surrender. And this pulsing, this timing began to shape everything around it. Animals learned to follow it, to migrate, to hibernate, to prepare. The fall of leaves wasn't just an ending. It was a signal, a soft warning, a shift, and the ground below became layered in echoes. Autumn upon autumn, pressed into loam, carbon locked beneath fallen veins. Not because the leaves forgot, but because they let go. And this letting go, this seasonal amnesia, became a kind of wisdom, a cyclical intelligence. What if memory doesn't only live in permanence? What if memory is a rhythm, a practice of release, a willingness to return? Even today, when we walk beneath modern forests in late September or early October, we are stepping through eons of habit. Not just weather, not just color, but echo. The leaves don't fall because they are weak. They fall because they have completed something. And every year they do it again. Maybe the first fall of leaves was not the end of summer. Maybe it was the beginning of grace. And yet, if even the trees learned to let go this way, what else might the earth be releasing softly into the silence? And if leaves could fall like golden memory, then surely, somewhere far beyond where we would expect, something still lives in the silence, beneath the weight of white. Long before ice claimed the poles, before frost sealed them in stillness, Earth wore a different face. One that tilted gently, breathed slower, and carried warmth farther than we thought possible. A world where green did not stop at the equator. A world where the poles were not so lonely. In the soft rock beds of Antarctica, buried beneath kilometers of ice and pressure, lie fossils that tell an impossible story. They are not bones, not shells, not minerals shaped by volcanoes or sea. They are ferns. Delicate veins. Imprints of fronds. Frozen echoes of a forest no one alive has ever seen. Is it possible that the ends of the earth were once covered in trees? That roots once curled through mossy tundra? That sunlight once filtered softly through high-latitude canopies, making green shadows in a place now silent and white? It wasn't always a frozen desert. In the Permian and later, in parts of the Cretaceous, warmth flowed in strange directions. Continental drift carried landmasses like slow, dreaming rafts. And when what we now call Antarctica rested closer to the equator, or when Earth's atmospheric weave thickened with greenhouse gases, forests grew in places we can scarcely imagine. Maybe they weren't like our forests. Maybe they pulsed to rhythms we no longer recognize. Months of daylight followed by months of dusk. A choreography of photosynthesis and patience. Light wasn't daily, it was seasonal. And the trees learned to wait. They grew wide, shallow roots. They stored what they could. They shed leaves not just for winter, but for the long pause of polar night. These forests weren't just surviving. They were inventing a new kind of time. And yet, they vanished. Not all at once, but slowly with the closing of an era. As climates cooled, as tectonic plates wandered further from the warmth, as the axis of Earth tilted and shifted again, these polar sanctuaries began to sleep. First under frost, then beneath snow, and finally beneath silence. We know them now only by their shadows in the rock. Leaf impressions pressed into stone like whispers. Carbon traces inside mineral seams. Lignin ghosts locked in sediment layers deep beneath the southern ice. And it makes you wonder, if such vast forests could disappear, if entire ecosystems could lie hidden for millions of years beneath sheets of silence, what else is waiting to be remembered? Could it be that Antarctica is not just a graveyard of green but a time capsule? That every meter of ice holds memories not just of weather, but of breath? Of birds nesting in branches now long vanished? Of insects humming in ancient polar twilight? And what about the Arctic? Though younger, it too once pulsed with life. Giant redwoods grew in parts of what is now northern Canada. Fossilized pollen drifts through layers of permafrost like dust from forgotten dreams. These weren't anomalies. They were chapters in Earth's long, turning story. A story where warmth was not a constant, but a traveler. Where plants adapted, wandered, returned. And the poles, those quiet places of ice and wind, weren't always so empty. They held roots, trunks, shade. What if the Earth remembers everything? Not just in fossils or isotope trails, but in the way wind still moves through valleys where forests once stood. In the way certain mosses persist near geothermal vents, still clinging to warmth. In the way ice itself presses down with the weight of memory. And maybe, beneath that pressure, something still breathes. Slowly, quietly, not because it's alive, but because it was. Because life once touched the coldest edges of this planet. And if green once reached that far, what else, we must ask, might it reach again? And yet, if the poles were once alive and are now silent, what does that say about silence itself? Is it always the end? Or just another season waiting to thaw? Perhaps, like all things Earth touches, the silence too is layered. Not empty, but full of whisper. Beneath the ice, beneath the stone, beneath even the dust, there are patterns. Circles, spirals, rings, concentric signatures carved not by human hand, but by trees and glaciers and wind-borne pollen. Memory etched in growth and retreat. A quiet kind of authorship, because plants, humble, rooted, and slow, have always kept time. Not with numbers or clocks, but with rhythm, with carbon, with repetition. Every season leaves a trace. Every drought, a scar. Every moment of warmth, a widening of rings. Even decay has pattern. Even loss leaves a record. Tree rings, for instance, are not just beautiful. They are precise. They tell stories in width and density, in lightness and dark. A thick band might speak of a year of gentle rain, a narrow one of hardship. Some trees, ancient bristlecones perched in dry solitude, hold thousands of years inside them. Silent sentinels recording climate not in ink, but in breath and bark. And further north or deeper south, where trees may not last, other record keepers remain. Ice cores, drawn from the heart of glaciers, contain bubbles of air older than civilization. Bubbles that once danced around the first leaves. That once moved through forests we no longer remember. And in those tiny pockets of atmosphere, trapped in time, we read the past. Ratios of carbon dioxide, levels of methane, ash from distant fires. Not because the ice wanted to remember, but because forgetting is never perfect. Then there are the sediments, quiet layers at the bottom of lakes. Every spring, pollen falls, drifting down like golden memory. Each grain a signature of what bloomed, what thrived, what faded. Over millennia, those layers become calendars. Strata of time too fine for the naked eye, yet there they are. Birch and pine, fern and grass, even flowers long gone, leave their chemical ghosts behind. And what is all this? But writing. Not writing as we know it. Not language, not syntax. But meaning, nonetheless. Earth has always been writing. Through plant and mineral. Through isotope and decay. Through carbon chains curling in and out of air. Perhaps the planet doesn't speak, but it does remember. Not because it has memory, but because it leaves marks. Like moss on stone. Like wind on dunes. Like rings in the wood of a fallen tree. Maybe these echoes, the rings, the cores, the ancient spores are a kind of diary. Not of emotions, but of experience. Not of thoughts, but of thresholds. Thresholds crossed. Thresholds lost. And we, arriving so recently, only just beginning to read. We decipher. We core. We extract. A cross-section of a pine. A plug of ancient ice. A thin slide of sediment under the microscope. And from these we rebuild the air. We map the rain. We estimate the light. We infer the forests. We imagine the wind. Could it be that we are reading not just climate but feeling? The slow, atmospheric exhale of a world in flux? And what else might be hidden in these layers? Beyond temperature, beyond drought, beyond carbon itself. Could there be patterns we have not yet seen? A rhythm in the fluctuations, a memory in the noise. What if these records are not just evidence, but warnings? Not because the trees knew, but because they endured, because they lived through shifts and collapses, through extinctions and renewals, through green abundance and gray stillness. And what if they are also hope? Not because they survived everything, but because they kept trying. Because even after catastrophe, plants grew again. In the ash, in the thaw, in the silence left behind by vanished giants. Some of the oldest climate records are in the DNA of seeds. In the way some plants germinate only after fire. In the way others remain dormant for years, waiting for just the right light, the right warmth, the right call to rise. That too is memory. A genetic echo. Promise written in green. Maybe memory, in the planetary sense, is less about detail and more about pattern. Less about remembering what happened, and more about how it felt. How the world moved through it. How it grew despite it. And so we keep reading. Tree by tree. Ice core by ice core. Grain by grain. Not because we know how the story ends, but because we are part of it now. Living inside the diary as it's still being written. And yet, if plants have been recording all this time in rings, in spores, in ash and air, then what else have they been trying to say? Maybe the answer lies in something simpler. Not in forests or cores or ancient carbon, but in a single fragile thing. The kind that floats down in autumn, spins gently through light, and disappears without a sound. A leaf, just a leaf. But is it? We think we know what it is. A green flare, a whisper of shade, a seasonal costume. But the truth is quieter, older, more layered than we often allow. A leaf is not just green, not just growth, not just food for roots and lungs. It is a puzzle of time, light, and geometry. It is a membrane stretched between sun and soil. It is memory again folded thin, because every leaf carries decisions. How much light to drink, how much to reflect, how wide to open its pores, how long to live before curling in on itself. Not because it thinks, but because it responds. Not because it remembers, but because it changes. Each morning chloroplasts stir. Each evening they rest. And in between, the leaf negotiates the terms of energy and entropy. It harvests sun, not all of it, but just the sliver that matters. Red and blue, never green. The green is what it gives away, what it cannot use, what it returns to the world, like a gentle refusal. And that return of light, of color, of visible breath is not without meaning. What if the green we see is the color of what remains? The light left over from the leaf's deeper work. A byproduct of life, disguised as beauty. Could it be that photosynthesis is not just function but signature? If we were to look closer into the cells, into the veins, into the almost invisible layers of a leaf's skin, we'd find order. Not chaos. Rows, tiers, tunnels of fluid, channels for water, for sugar, for the sky itself. A leaf is not just surface. It is architecture. It is structure tuned to time. And time moves through it strangely. Some leaves last hours, others months. But all of them, every single one, has a beginning and an end. A moment of unfurling, a slow reach toward light, and then, at last, a fade, crisping, a fall. Maybe it's not decay. Maybe it's punctuation. Could we say, then, that leaves are clocks? Not ticking ones, but organic ones. Clocks made of cells, not gears. Measuring seasons, not seconds. Reading not the hour, but the angle of the sun. Maybe every deciduous tree wears time on its branches. Not because it must, but because it can. And perhaps, too, a leaf is a map. Not of land, but of process. A record of drought in its curled edges. A sign of pollution in its color. A symptom of wind in its torn skin. Each vein like a path through possibility. Each hole in the fabric a trace of hunger, or disease, or adaptation. Some scientists have used leaves as paleobarometers, tools to sense the air of ancient epochs. The number of tiny breathing pores, the stomata, tells us about carbon levels long ago. Tells us if the earth was gasping or calm. Not because the leaf knew, but because it grew accordingly. So what then is a leaf? A mirror of the sky? A solar engine? A sponge for photons? All of these, none of them. It is a thing that does not last, but always returns, that dies quietly, but in dying, feeds the next, that lives at the edge of energy and matter, that gives more than it keeps. Maybe a leaf is not meant to be one thing. Maybe it is many identities overlapping, photosynthetic, poetic, statistical, symbolic. Maybe the leaf is Earth's gentle way of touching light. And if that is true, if one leaf can carry that much function, that much time, that much silent knowing, then what might we find in the next? And the next after that? And the next after that? Until we realize we've been walking for miles through green inheritance, without ever asking whose dream we're inside. Because here we are, breathing, eating, thinking. Inside an atmosphere tuned by chlorophyll. Inside bodies fed by roots we didn't plant. Inside a world textured by a memory we did not make. And yet, we live by it, built from it, dependent on it, though we often forget. We inhale what they exhaled. We chew the sugars they spun from starlight. We speak in languages developed beside trees. We build with the bones of ancient forests turned to stone. Not because we designed it that way, but because it was already waiting for something or someone to notice. Could it be that we're not the beginning but a continuation? A soft ripple in a longer pattern? One of many passing passengers in chlorophyll's slow-burning dream. The green, after all, came first. Long before cities. Long before stories. Before even breath had rhythm. Chlorophyll was writing poems in light before lungs knew how to read them. And those poems, those quiet, leafy verses are everywhere. In the folds of a cabbage. In the shimmer of pond algae. In the delicate curve of a fern's spiral. They echo, faintly, with the same refrain. Convert light, store energy, release air. Again, and again, and again. As if the earth, once it found this trick, refused to let it go. Maybe this was never about dominance, but persistence. About holding on. Even through extinction. Even through fire and flood and freeze. Even through silence. Because even when the forests fell, the dream stayed. When the continents shifted, the spores traveled. When volcanoes darkened the skies, some seeds waited in the soil. Patient, dormant, dreaming of light, not because they could plan, but because the code was already inside them. An instinct as old as breath. So what does that make us? Inheritors? Intruders? Interpreters? Maybe none of those words fit. Maybe we are just echoes too. Made of rearranged atoms that once sat in sap. Built from carbon once held in leaf. Water that once coursed through vine. Bones borrowed from photosynthesis. And food, how much of what we eat is green's memory? A tomato carries the sun's laughter. A grain of rice, the echo of monsoon. A grape, the sweetness of drought survived. We consume not just calories but conditions. Not just substance but circumstance. Every bite is a geological archive. Every meal, a lesson in slow inheritance. Could that be why forests calm us? Why gardens heal? Why looking at leaves feels like remembering something we never lived? Perhaps, somewhere deep in the layers of our perception, we recognize them. Not visually but chemically, viscerally. Maybe the mind doesn't remember, but the molecules do. And in dreams, have you noticed, plants are always watching. Not moving but present. Background. Essential. Silent companions. Perhaps they've always been dreaming us back. Inviting us not to rise above nature, but to return to it. To rejoin the long rhythm of light entering life, then leaving again. And if that rhythm continues, if we are not an exception but an extension, then maybe it's not our story at all. Maybe we are not the heroes of this planet, but the inheritors of something far stranger, far older, far quieter. A lineage not of kings or conquests, but of chloroplasts and roots and silent, still devotion to the sun. Maybe we are just the latest vessel through which the green dream flows, the current bearers of a memory etched not in words, but in pigment, in photosynthesis, in breath. And yet, if we've come this far, held so softly by what came before, what else might be holding us still? The leaves do not speak, not in words, but they listen. In the rustling hush between wind and root, something is always recorded. A memory not stored in books or brains or binary, but in the slow pattern of pollen, the layering of soil, the curling of tendrils over stone. Earth has been watching. The moss has noticed. The forests have kept score, not by intention but by absorption. Quiet, patient, atmospheric memory. So then, what will they remember of us? Will the roots recall our footsteps, heavy with roads and rubber and rhythm? Will the spores note the warmth we left in the air, not from breath, but from fuel? Will the sediments whisper of plastic rain, of artificial polymers drifting like pollen in a wind no tree ever called? Maybe not. Memory is not always accurate. But it is persistent. Fossils once took ages to form: pressure, heat, burial. But now, a candy wrapper lodged in the strata may become tomorrow's technofossil. A scrap of polyester, a layer of ash, a spike in atmospheric carbon, a sudden drop in diversity. These are the echoes we etch. Not because we mean to, but because we act. Because we build. Because we forget. And yet, the plants remain. They absorb. They metabolize. They carry on. Not untouched, but unresisting. Their silence is not surrender. It is continuity. Green continues to grow, between bricks, over ruins, inside abandoned buildings, across bomb craters, through our noise, through our clutter, through the scaffold of civilization itself. A vine doesn't know geopolitics. A fern doesn't ask who made the concrete it breaks. But could it be that they do learn us? Not in story, but in structure. Not in theory, but in threshold. Already they respond. Some evolve. Some move faster. Some flower early. Some fail. Already, they are adapting to a world we reshaped, to hotter nights, to saltier winds, to shifting seasons that forget the calendar. Some bloom out of time. Some wait too long. Some disappear. Maybe this, too, is how plants remember, not in preservation but in pattern shift. Not in keeping things as they were, but in altering their own futures in response. Maybe they don't store our legacy. Maybe they become it. And what do we leave behind in them? Increased nitrogen in the leaves of the highlands. Traces of antibiotics in river reeds. Synthetic hormones in dandelions. Glacial pollen records now capped by plastics. Tree rings that mark nuclear winters not caused by volcanoes. Seeds that germinate in landfills. These aren't just signs. They're stories. Softly written. Unedited. Undeniable. Maybe that's what a legacy really is. Not the loud declarations of a species trying to name itself, but the quiet changes we cause in others. In what can no longer grow or what must now grow differently. What if memory isn't what we keep, but what we leave behind in those we never asked? And still, the plants try. Some of them fix our carbon. Some of them filter our water. Some even detoxify our waste. Not because they owe us anything, but because survival is the only language they've ever spoken fluently. Could it be that in some far future epoch, long after we're dust, a single leaf may carry the shadow of us? Not a monument, not a myth, but an adjustment, an adaptation, a difference in structure, a pigment tuned slightly against a sky more silver than blue, a photosystem recalibrated for sunlight altered by aerosol echoes. And would that be grief? Or grace? Maybe the plants will not blame us. Maybe they will not praise us either. Maybe they will simply carry on, as they always have, gathering light, building sugar, releasing breath, one cell at a time, one generation at a time, holding our fingerprints in their veins, but never needing to ask our names. And if that's true, then perhaps the real question is not what they will remember, but whether we'll be remembered kindly. Not because we were powerful, but because we paused, because we listened, because we learned to see them not as scenery, but as sentience. Not as backdrop, but as inheritance. And maybe, just maybe, that's still possible. Because even now, in the cracks of cities, green still tries. In the corners of rooftops. In the forgotten fields. In the smallest gestures of regrowth. A sprout reaching toward the light is not a conclusion. It is a continuation. And yet, if plants have shaped so much of what we are, our air, our weather, our food, our form, then the question remains, what might they become, shaped in turn by us?